Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, your guide to the Whitetail Woods. Presented by First Light, creating proven, versatile hunting apparel for the stand, saddle, or blind. First Light. Go farther, stay longer. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. This week on the show, I'm joined by Owen Reigler of Midwest Whitetail to discuss the little details that help him consistently kill big bucks, including his biggest ever just this month. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light and our Camo for Conservation program, in which a sale of every piece of First Light camouflage in the Spectre camo pattern, a portion of those proceeds goes back to the National Deer Association to help them on their mission to make things better for deer and deer hunters all across the country. I actually just spent the weekend with some folks from the National Deer Association down in Kentucky. It was the final event of our Working for Wildlife tour. We had a whole bunch of hunters come out and volunteer on public land on Saturday collecting white oak acorns. And we were actually collecting these white oak acorns so that they can be used to be planted at a nursery, get these oak seedlings out of the ground, and then replanted to help with a reforestation effort on the Daniel Boone National Forest. Incredible stuff. We picked up more than 700 pounds of acorns, which I believe they said will equate to something like 15,000 new oak trees that are going to be planted out there on public land. How cool is that? So that's it. Today, speaking of cool things, we are talking deer hunting, and I'm joined by Owen Reigler of Midwest Whitetail. Hopefully you've seen some of Owen's stuff over the years. He's been a major contributor over there to Chasing November and their daily blogs and all the different things that Midwest Whitetail's got going on. He has been consistently killing, really impressive deer over the years there in his home state of Iowa. Interestingly, he's also from Michigan, so we've got a shared backstory there. And today in the show, I wanted to have Owen on to talk about something I've noticed in a lot of his videos and a lot of the things that come up in the conversations with him on those videos, in which he's talking about these little things that he focuses on, these little details, these minute parts of his strategy that actually matter a lot. There's all these things that have gone into Owen's kind of process to hunting big deer over the years that maybe now he doesn't even think about that much. But I think for the rest of us, they're very interesting. It's those small things, in many cases, that will allow you to close the distance, to close the gap when trying to kill an old deer, a big old deer. Now, there's a happy medium, right? I think last week's episode with Brad was a great reminder that sometimes we overcomplicate things. And today with Owen, it's going to be a great reminder that sometimes we do need to be paying attention to the little things though too. So there's something we can take from both of these guys. And today, Owen's going to help us kind of understand his strategy and his approach. And we're going to use the story of a deer he just recently killed. And this story, I think, will be a great framework and a great illustration of how he does things. And it just so happens to be the biggest deer of his entire life, which is saying something. This is a giant deer. It's a great story. It's pretty darn cool to get to have this kind of example to work with and have a video to be able to look back and actually watch it too. So as we have this discussion, remember that you can go over to their YouTube channel and then watch the hunt that we're discussing to kind of see both sides of the equation. Now, in addition to Owen being on the show, we've also got Josh Sparks, who also is over there at Midwest Whitetail, and he has been kind of I don't want to call him a fly on the wall, but he's been like a participant and an observer of Owen over the years as he's hunted, and specifically as he's been chasing this specific buck. Josh has got to be out there doing some of this work with him, observing some of it, been in conversations with him, and we thought it'd be fun to have Josh join the podcast too, because he's got this very interesting perspective of watching Owen do all this stuff. So Josh knows some things that I just don't know that he can ask about. So Josh helps us out here today with throwing in some new questions, some color commentary on the hunt, and really helps us round out this conversation. So Owen and Josh are joining me here today. It's a lot of fun. We're going to learn from one of the best big deer hunters out there, and I couldn't be more excited for it. So with that said, let's get to my chat with Owen Reigler and Josh Sparks. All right, here with me now, I've got Owen Reigler and Josh Sparks. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you, sir. It's good to be here. Can't be talking about big deer with the big man, as we like to refer to him around here. So,
well, you couldn't get any better circumstances either, because Owen, you're coming off quite the successful hunt. When people see this, it'll be a couple weeks, but I know here it's relatively fresh on your mind. So congratulations on that buck, Owen.
Thanks a lot. It's like winning the genetic lottery, I think, is what that comes down to. Having done this all these years, it's just so rare to get a deer to that size,
Yeah. Well, like we were saying before we start recording, both of us having been from Michigan, you can just see not only the genetic differences, but then the nutritional differences and the hunting pressure difference. There's big differences between, what might be possible in a place like where you and I grew up versus what you have there in Iowa now. And to your point, like you're enjoying the benefits of that. But all of that brings me to one of the first things I want to talk to you about, which is Michigan, where we both grew up, where I still am. And I'm curious what those early years were like when you were learning to deer hunt in Michigan. Because I went through that thing, and I first hunted on the upper, so it'd be the northwest part of the state, lower peninsula, but northwest part of the lower peninsula was where I kind of cut my teeth. And we hardly saw any deer. If we saw a deer, it was a little 1.5-year buck. Like a 1.5-year-old buck was an absolute trophy for anyone in my family. And if you got a 2-year-old 8-pointer, that was, talk of the town. So that's what I had for the first 18 years of my life. What was that like for you, and how did that either help you become the deer hunter you are, or hurt you or slow you down in your hunting process as you were trying to learn to hunt in that kind of place?
Yeah, I think it was very similar to what you described. It was the same kind of thing. It was so difficult. You would see tracks, you would see rubs, you'd see scrapes, but you'd never see the deer. And so it became just more and more intriguing all the time. That's so bad when somebody would shoot a deer, I'd have to go see it. I'd be like, Dad, we got to go see this buck, because I was so intrigued that, they actually do exist. You see the sign, but you never see the deer. And I would look at them. I would look at their hooves, just every little thing I really think that's what made me love deer hunting, because it was so difficult there. You could see videos and stuff, other guys shooting nice bucks, and it was so difficult to do. I feel like it really just drew me in. If it was easy from the start, or you seen a lot of nice deer, I don't know if I would love it like I do now.
It's funny you say that, because Josh, before we were recording, you were asking us about this, and how you grew up in Iowa, surrounded by, the Shangri-La of deer hunting. And I've got a lot of friends who are in the same situation. And I've always thought the opposite of what you were thinking, which is I'm surprised people in Iowa like it as much as they do, because it's like you started on third base. But me and Owen, we started, at home, far, far, far away from ever hitting that grand slam. And so we had to fall in love with deer hunting despite the fact we never saw bucks, despite the fact that we never saw a big deer and knew the opportunities that could be possible. And I think, whatever downsides that came with, it certainly did build in an appreciation for those older deer as being so rare and special. I remember growing up, we had this hunting camp up in northern Michigan, our family deer camp, and old log cabin. And there's this wooden door that my grandpa posted pictures on for years, for decades. And there was all these pictures of the old hunts, a 7-pointer over top of an old Buick hood of a sedan, that kind of stuff, a buck pole, all these great pictures. But there was one picture on there, and it was a newspaper clipping of a 10-point buck. Looking back on it now in my memory, it was probably 125-inch type 10-pointer. And I remember for most of my childhood well into my teenage years, I thought that was fake. I thought that was not a real deer. I thought that was impossible for deer to get that big, and that this must have been something that my grandpa had I thought it was maybe a painting or something. It was actually a photograph, but I just couldn't believe deer actually got that big. And then, eventually I started seeing magazines or TV shows or whatever when I was, in my younger years and eventually realized like, oh, wow, it's not like where I am now everywhere else. But in addition to that appreciation, I think that having to learn to deer hunt in a place like that forced me to pay attention to a lot of little things. It forced me to get really good at certain things because, when I started trying to kill a 3-year-old buck, that was like incredibly hard because there might be one 3-year-old buck in a square mile, and that was the best deer around. And so I had to do things to kill a deer like that made me have to really focus on the little things and the details. And in watching a lot of your stuff, Owen, listening to you talk over the years on Midwest Whitetail, I've heard a lot of the same things. I've heard a lot of those same ideas come from you. And I'm just curious if that came from just who you are or if that stemmed from your learning to hunt in Michigan where that was necessary to ever see a half decent deer. Like what do you think about that?
I'd say probably a combination of both of those things. I think the grit and determination probably came from Michigan where, like you alluded to, I mean, you really had to go the extra mile to get a decent buck there, So I think to really hunt hard and all that kind of thing, I think did come from Michigan,
What do you
train of thought?
Oh, that's all right. I was going to also ask you what you think, if it wasn't that, what do you think the greatest thing you took away from your Michigan hunting experience was? Like the greatest lesson you learned from those years that has in some way made you the deer hunter you are now?
I think it really is just that grit and determination and just not giving up, just being out there. I always say there's no substitute for tree time, and I really believe that. I mean, you can do all the things you want and, be a great hunter and do all the things right, but you just got to be out there. So many times I've proven that to myself that, it wasn't going right. You're hunting one big deer and you're just struggling. You can't see him, and you just keep going and you keep going, you keep grinding, and then boom, 2 minutes of time just changed everything,
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a lesson to be learned right there is you just got to stay determined.
Yeah. So you spent, when was it that you moved from Michigan to Iowa? How old were you?
I was 2002. I was 27, about Josh's age. Yep.
Okay.
6.
Yeah. So you leave Michigan, you go to Iowa. It's the promised land. Did you right away, did you feel like you could take what you had learned in Michigan and apply it to what was happening in Iowa and right away get on deer? Or did you have to change some of your process or your strategy in this new area?
No, I felt like what I'd learned in Michigan, I mean, that's just about as tough as it gets. At the time, I think we had about 800,000 gun hunters. And if you took that philosophy into Iowa, I mean, yeah, you could kill deer. I think I'd hunted 2 days in Iowa when I shot a 167. So I'm like, what?
Yeah.
And so.
Wasn't your first trip, it wasn't Iowa, if I remember correctly, it was Missouri?
It was,
It was with your dad?
Yeah. Well, the trip with my dad was in Iowa, but I went to Missouri by myself. Yeah.
Okay, because that was like I think that when we talk about what inspired you to really just jump and go for it, it was actually hunting, not here, it was, your first out-of-state trip. You got to see more big deer and you're driving around scouting, I think is what you talked about.
Right.
Than you really had ever seen in Michigan. I don't know, the thing that I've always admired about your journey was like, you just went for it, and so obviously today with the episodes, keyboard warriors of YouTube always like to, if I had Owen's situation or I always feel the need to go into the defense mode of like, well, you don't because you never took the risks that he did. And yes. I think a lot of inspiration. And then, you made the comment about, Michigan hunting versus Iowa hunting, like when we're growing up. And I think that's the beautiful thing about bow hunting and specificity is that everybody starts somewhere different. For me, I got to see a lot of big deer, but man, did I screw it up over and over and over. Mm-hmm. And I feel like if I would have had some success, granted, I got to see bigger deer, and that was a privilege, no doubt. I didn't know there wasn't big deer anywhere else. You know what I mean? I just thought you deer hunt and whatever. But it's the failures, for lack of a better term. You can always grow in some way. And I think now where we're at in this story of making the jump from Michigan to Missouri or Iowa, it was just the next chapter, the next challenge. And most people don't make the jump. And I think that's what, I think that's where it all starts.
Yeah.
Owen, was that an easy decision for you, or was that something that you were really torn on?
I was torn on it because all of my family's in Michigan, and so I'd never been away from my family. It was real close to my parents. So it was tough when it really came down to it, but it was something that I just wanted so bad. I just loved to hunt. My dad loved to hunt so much. It's like, part of me probably wanted to make my dad proud. I wanted to come out and build actually what I've done here. It was inspirational, I think, just from the standpoint of making my dad proud, and a lot of people probably don't see the sacrifices that go into it. I've spent a lot of time away from my kids, a lot of time away from my parents, and people don't see that kind of stuff when they watch this. They're like, must be nice kind of mentality. And when you come from humble beginnings like I did, basically no money, I got, free lunches in school. We didn't have anything, very loving parents. I couldn't ask for better ones, but to go from nothing to, what I've built here, you really, it'd be nice if everybody knew the story of what that took. You had to be a workaholic the whole time. And of course, you didn't get to hunt as much as you wanted, but I just kept building my life around the hunting lifestyle, the whitetail lifestyle, I like to call it. And just, I kept making decisions of, switching jobs or starting my own company, all this kind of stuff to just keep building more and more to where you could hunt more and work less. And, so finally where I've got to today. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You mentioned some of those intangibles, some of that stuff around just being a hard worker or being willing to make sacrifices. From where you are now, looking back on your 20, whatever, almost 20 years or whatever has been since you made that move, and as you've grown as a hunter, what do you think some of those most intangibles have been that have led to you being successful? Because to your point, this wasn't handed to you on a silver platter. It took not just hard work, but a whole bunch of other things, I'm sure. And a lot of folks, we all have different situations. We're all hunting different places. We all have different levels of access or resources or time. But there is something to be said about like personal characteristics, intangibles that every one of us can put into action. We could all work harder. We could all be more perseverant. We could all, whatever it might be. What do you think some of those very most important character parts and pieces have been for you to be successful? Because that's something that translates everywhere. Anyone can do that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I was given the tools, and maybe God-given tools, or maybe I learned a lot of them just to be a hard worker. My work ethic was probably off the charts for, 25, 30 years, which, I don't know exactly where that comes from. Maybe it was just my personality, or maybe, my dad teaching me to work when I was just a kid. Go out there if you want to do this, you can have the money. And being that we were poor, I think that it put more emphasis on wanting to do that. Like, I want to buy a bow, right? We don't have money to buy a bow. So if you want a bow, you're going to go out there and take tires off from rims for, 10, 12 hours to take these rims in and scrap steel. And stuff like that, I think you just learn along the way. And eventually it just leads to, where I'm at today, I guess. I would say just work ethic. I don't know if it was learned or God-given, but either way, I'm thankful for it.
Yeah. So that work ethic led you just recently to killing your biggest deer ever. Has that been confirmed? Is he as big as you thought he was?
He is every bit as big, if not better. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So what I kind of thought we could do is take that story, which is kind of like the culmination of all of your years of hunting and personal growth. It's led you to this moment, it seems like. I want to use this specific story to hopefully uncover all of the parts of your process that led to this success. And not just this success, but the many, many, many other deer that you've killed over the years. So where I kind of want to start is towards the end of the story. And you can jump back into history to tell me about whatever you think is most important from the past. But if I could have us pick up the story of this buck you call Loch Ness in the spring, after you picked up both of his sheds. You found one, and then I don't know how much longer it was later in the spring, you had some buddies come out and they continued the search with you. And now you've got the match set, both antlers from this buck Loch Ness that you think has the potential to be the buck of a lifetime, and you decide, all right, this is the deer I'm going to try to kill this year. What do the following weeks and months look like for you, Owen, when you have one specific buck that is of this nature that your year is going to revolve around? You've got habitat work, you've got stand prep work, maybe there's scouting work, maybe there's just sitting up late at night looking at maps or photos or something. Can you walk me through some of those most important things you did in the few months after that as you start building this whole mousetrap, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically the same for Loch Ness as it had been for a lot of other deer. I had learned that if you would manipulate the landscape and the food and all that and keep it the same, a lot of times the bucks would do the same thing. And so that was my goal, going into the year. I wanted everything to be just the same and hoping he would do the same thing, live in the same area. And it did come to fruition. He did do that. He obliged, and it worked out. So
How many years have you owned this piece?
I've been here 6 or 7.
Okay, so not too much longer than how long I've known you. Because
Yeah.
I think, part of what you're trying to say there is like Loch Ness was just the newest tenet, for lack of a better term. And I remember when I met Owen back in 2018, he wasn't improving his farm based on the buck that was there,
Right.
if that makes sense. Like, I look at you and it's like the process of when you first got here. Maybe that's where it really starts. Loch Ness is just 6 years later, the buck that happens to live there. But one thing that's so different, and maybe there's factors that you think that influence this, but your piece of property, if a buck is in a certain zip code, the chances are he's going to do what the 5.5, 6.5-year-old that was there 3 years ago is what that one did. And I've never seen a lot of properties like that. And it's almost like you've maximized your acreage,
Right.
Whether that's the food, whether that's your food plot architecture from the standpoint of bow hunting them. Maybe it's you bought this farm, you had all these years of developing your strategies and fine tuning. Okay, you got the piece of dirt when you first closed on it. What was your steps then?
Right. Yeah. And that's the same on all these farms. So like Josh alluded to, it doesn't just happen when I have a buck that I want to go after. So this is every year I'm doing all the same kind of things. I'm out there trying to improve, TSI, and it's just really thinking about what does the farm need in any given farm. What does it need? What can I do? Where can I put food? Where can I put water? And so all this is going into every farm every year. And so, when a certain buck comes along, it's just a continuation of what you've always done. So, really not a lot of new stuff. It's just what I've always done, really.
So what makes this zone such a great, I don't know, we'll call it like a buck hotel, right? It seems like if you're saying like every year, if a big buck's around, this is where he wants to be. And when the top dog is knocked off the pedestal because you got him, the next buck fills in that vacancy. What have you made here, or what have you set aside to make them safe, or what makes this hold a top tier deer like this consistently?
The secluded timber, I would say, is the number one factor to this. There is a secluded timber that's kind of in the middle. I would say it's a sanctuary, for lack of better terms. It's not like I never go into it, but if I do hunt around it, it's usually with the wind blowing away from that timber. And so they just feel secure in that. It's a big thicket, and, they live in there, and, I try to hunt them on the fringes. I rarely ever hunt inside that timber, so I wait for them to come out of that and just, leave that to them. And a lot of times you'll see it'll be interesting. A buck will be in an area that, like the crab spot you guys may have heard of before, that there's always a big buck down there. And, once he gets removed, or maybe another dominant buck moves in, they'll displace a little bit and they'll find their place. I see that a lot with these big dominant bucks is, they'll find their 10 acres. That's what they call home. And that's, they kind of own that area. So that's always interesting to see. But I would say, the thicket and the habitat work has been probably the number one factor.
Well, okay, I just bought my first farm. What's habitat work mean though? Like, I know TSI, timber stand improvement, but maybe somebody listening or even me, like, well, what's the next layer of tiers? I bought a farm, I achieved the dream, help me make the most of it.
Right. And I think every farm's a little bit different. It's just a matter of seeing what you have, what it needs, Is it wide open timber with no undergrowth? I mean, so is that what you need? Do you need undergrowth? I mean, it's looking at all the variables and deciding what it needs, so.
One thing I think is interesting here is you do maybe, I feel like I always grew up thinking deer season, food plots, green plots, ag. Your brain is 365. I want that buck to live right there.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. And you learn a lot of things along the way. I think one of the differences, Mark, coming from Michigan is you don't have to have all timber. I know when I moved out here, I wanted to hunt all the timbered stuff. Well, out here, a lot of the deer are in more open areas. If you've got, some cover, brushy cover that's more open, a lot of times that's where your big bucks will bed. And so that's always interesting to take note. You don't need to always make it the thickest, rabbit hole, rabbit can't crawl through it kind of thing. It's interesting to see how they're a little bit different out here. And I suppose as you go farther west, it's even more so that way.
Yeah. You mentioned, these big old bucks will have their little 10-acre pocket or something that they claim. Something we've been talking to a lot of folks about recently is just how buck behavior changes as they get older. And when you get that 5, 6, 7, or 8-year-old deer, whatever, a lot of folks talk about how they see a deer's core area shrink, tighten up the older they get. Is that something you've seen too with those old deer that you've got to observe and hunt?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's been so much fun to watch them over the years, but you see them, maybe as a 3-year-old and they're all over the whole farm and they're sporadic. That's why a lot of them get killed because they move so much. And as they get older in that dominance hierarchy, they start gaining ground there. They start going into these pockets where they want to be. Now they're no longer pushed out by a crabs or a wide nine or whatever. So they start to claim these prime areas. And those are usually the areas that have the bedding they want to be in. It's got the food, the water, it's got everything they want, and especially the does. And every year they just start condensing down smaller and smaller. And it was no different with this Loch Ness buck. I mean, looking back now, I think he was living in an area that was less than 10 acres.
Wow.
I mean, just a tiny, that's why I couldn't catch him on a lot of cameras, didn't know where he was because he was living in such a small pocket.
Do you find with a deer like that where the core area gets so tight, there's a certain predictability to it that should help you as a hunter. But on the flip side, it seems like there's this high risk of, if you mess up in that bedroom, you're right on top of him. It's not like he's all over the place. There's like one spot. And if you're going to make a mistake, it's going to be right in his bedroom, which is, seemingly usually a high risk spot. How did that impact the way you thought about hunting this deer or any other old buck that's done something similar? Do you worry about that or do you not because they're so dead set on wanting to be in their little pocket that it's hard to push them out of there?
Yeah, I mean, I still worry about it. I mean, that's why I usually hunt the fringes. Like if I have an idea where he's bedding, where he's living, I want to hunt the outside fringes of that and not just go busting right into where he's living because I'm sure you could change that up or at the very least make him completely nocturnal. Mm-hmm. So, that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Well, I think it goes back to where you kind of steer this conversation, Mark, of you found those antlers. First, I think for the folks that might have no idea about Loch Ness, it really wasn't, you were like, oh, I'm hunting the buck of a lifetime. I'll never forget, we found those antlers. I'm like, oh, and you got to talk about it just in case he's alive because he was not in the best of spirits.
You didn't think you made it?
Yeah, he had that big hematoma. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he had a great big hematoma on his right side. And after he shed pretty early. I'm looking at all my trail photos and looking for a buck with a hematoma, a shed buck, and I could never find one. And so I'm just thinking, well, he died. I mean, he didn't make it through. And of course, so disappointed if that's the case, because you spent all this time and resources trying to make sure this is the one buck that you wanted to hunt your whole life. He looked like he had the genetics for it. And so, yeah, I was pretty disappointed. They get under your skin, almost like kids or something. I mean, it's just, you're super attached to them, really. It's kind of wild, but.
Yeah. So another thing I'm thinking about with these, tight home ranges, or when you have we'll call it like a buck hotel that always holds a good deer in there. One of the things that I've had the luxury of starting to think about is I've got a few places that I've hunted year after year after year now where I'm getting to the point now where bucks can reach maturity. We were talking about this before we started recording. Like I've got a spot now where I can get a 5-year-old buck in Michigan, but it's not always, a big antlered deer. I get a lot of, solid mature bucks now, but only every once in a while do I get a deer that comes around that might break that 140-inch mark here. That's pretty rare. It's like once every 5 to 10 years, I'll get a deer maybe that could get over 140. So something I've started thinking about more now. I know a lot of people talk about this kind of stuff in places where this is commonplace, but for me, it's relatively rare. I've started thinking like, man, do I need to start shooting some of these deer that are 4 that are, just a big solid bully 8-pointer because he's claiming the best buck hotel. And now I've got this really nice up and coming 3-year-old who never could claim that because this gnarly old 4 or 5-year-old deer has been here forever. And then that freewheeling 3-year-old that has the possibility to be a 150, 160 someday, he's relegated to 3rd or 4th place in the general area and he gets killed by the neighbors because of that. Something like that. Have you ever had to go to this level like buck management where you are taking out a deer out of the buck hotel because you want that to open up for some good 3 or 4-year-old that might be in the area?
Man, did you hit the nail on the head with that? You'll see me a lot of times always talk about, it doesn't matter the antler size buck. If he's an old aggressive buck, always talk about managing the farm. And you were so spot on with that. That's probably the number one factor of why these bigger bucks have been there is because I continue to shoot these bully bucks, these 8s or whatever they are, and that makes room for that buck that, like we talk about, that dominance hierarchy. If that big bully buck is in there. I mean, I had 2 years ago, my girlfriend shot one of the bucks. It was just super dominant in the very area the Loch Ness was in. So I think that was key. I mean, you got to continue to do that. I think you're spot on.
Is there anything when you're trying to do that? The first thing I think about when I'm imagining this scenario is I want to try to hunt and kill this bully buck. At the same time, I don't want to put so much pressure to educate the up and coming buck that I want to kill next year or 2 years from now. Do you hunt for these? I don't want to call them call bucks, but we'll call them like a management buck. Do you ever hunt a management buck in a different kind of way because you're trying to preserve the best spot for that young buck, or does that not matter because it's going to be a year or 2 later anyways, and that's not going to translate?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much hunt them the same as all of them because I am hunting the fringes. I'm not really diving into their bedroom so much anyway. So I'm on the fringe either way. So I pretty much hunt them the same way. I might just hunt them a little more aggressive as far as the time I put in trying to get them,
Okay.
Details, you guys talked about that, having to pay attention to the details coming from Michigan. You say you hunt them the same way, but it's like the way you set up your farm, your deer don't even know you're there.
Right.
I mean, and that might be something to talk about because
Yeah.
you hunt almost every day, you can.
Yeah.
But it's in a way that like people might think of the word pressure. Just because you're there doesn't mean that you're leaving an impact, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. How do you pull that off?
Yeah, I mean, going back to even like the trails I make to these stands, so you don't have to make a big ruckus getting in there. You're minimizing your scent. Almost everything's got some type of trail to it, either a mowed path or we go in and clear out the brush. Now I've been able to get to a point where I've got equipment. So if I want to go in, pull out some small trees so we can slip through an area quietly, I'll do that, And so like Josh said, it's keeping the pressure down, even though you're in there hunting quite a bit. You don't hunt it on the wrong wind direction and all that kind of stuff.
I've seen you in some videos when you're talking about your habitat improvements. You've mentioned a few different times that you look at access first. So before figuring out where you want to put a food plot, you're looking at access first, and then you pick a tree, and then you design the plot around the access in the tree. Can you elaborate on that a little bit and how you think about access to these farms when you're setting up an ambush location? Like what are the really important factors and what are some of the tricks that you found for accessing and exiting these places that are still good to hunt, but you can slip in and out without these deer knowing it?
Right. Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I think it's so critical to be able to get in and get out of there without them knowing you're hunting them, especially if you're going to hunt, day after day or multiple days in a row. And so usually I'll start with waterways. I mean, great places to access is, down creek drainages or washouts, that kind of thing. And anytime you can walk those down and pop up out of those right to a tree stand or a blind or whatever you're hunting, I think it's great strategy. And I've got a lot of stuff like that. That's that's where I start. So I've got majority of my stuff. You'll see even my tree stands are right off of drainage of some type. You can climb down the tree and into the drainage and walk it out.
Yep. When it comes to your paths that you're making, you mentioned mowing it, doing some other work like that. Do you go to the point of clearing leaves in season? Because I know some guys will actually in season try to clear leaves so that it's silent when you're walking. I've always worried about that, and like going in there and raking a trail or blowing a trail would just seem like too much human activity in season, but some people do it. Do you?
I have before, yeah. We've done some pretty crazy stuff. I remember one time, this was back probably 15 years ago, we raked a trail, regular rakes, no leaf blower or anything, over a quarter of a mile because we had bumped deer a couple times going in there. And I'm like, that attention to detail, we can't have that if we're going to have a good hunt. And so we go in and rake a trail all the way down the ravine, up, up the hills. And it's a lot of work, but when you're just a lunatic about it, it just seems normal. That's what you do.
When you do that, are you paying attention to the wind? Because I think about going in, it's like you just walk in and start raking just because you scared some deer. I mean, like, are you paying attention to those same details of like you're raking on the right wind?
Right.
I mean, like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's the thing about you. It doesn't just stop there. You're like, oh, I go in a rake to be quiet, but it's like there's 15 other factors that if you like poke and pry, you're like, well, yeah, I mean, duh, of course I do it this way.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I don't necessarily think of that stuff anymore because it's automatic. But yeah, when you're going in there raking your path, you're doing it on the right wind based on where you think the deer are bedding.
Any other factor to when you would choose to do something like that? Would you also, like, is there a certain time of the season you'd want to do that? Is there a certain, I'm assuming you'd want to do it midday, but is that a thing like you would do just before the rut? Or are you doing that mid-October during the, quote unquote lull period? Or do you do it, when would you do something like that?
Yeah, I think
Rainy
early
day?
to mid-October. Yeah, early to mid-October for me because you still got a lot of that foliage up, so you're a little more hidden. You're not probably making as big a disturbance as you think you are. And those leaves, once you get them cleared out of there, I mean, it stays pretty clear. I mean, you don't have to go back in there all the time and do that. I mean, it'll just about last you a season. You can still be pretty quiet.
Yeah.
Would you do it at nighttime because the deer aren't in that bedding area anymore?
I mean, that's a good point. I haven't, but you certainly could. Yeah.
Yeah. So what about the other things when it comes to your actual stand setups or blind setups? You've got paths to every single one of them. Sometimes you will rake leaves to make sure that that path is safe and quiet. You've got, if it's not a mowed trail, it's an access route through a waterway or a creek or something like that. What are the other little things you're doing to make sure that a stand site is as good as possible? Like when you're sitting there on the day you're prepping it, whether it's in February or August or whatever it is that you're doing that, what are the little things that you're trying to line up to make it just right, whether it be picking the right tree and having cover in it, or whether it be, different things you're adding to the location? Like I've seen you add some things to hunt locations. What are some of those most important things in your mind?
I think all the above, as you alluded to, a lot of times we're adding cover, if it's a tree. I think the location is the most important. So I'll take a mediocre tree in a great location versus the other way around. I think that's the most important. So a lot of times I'll add cover to a tree because that's where I want to be. And then the other just small details like trimming every limb that could pose a problem, like there's that one limb, and I know guys that help me and stuff probably drives them nuts. So I'm like, can you get that one limb right there that's 37 feet up in the air? Stuff like that. But sometimes it just makes the difference. I mean, how many times have you heard guys say like, I had him at 20 yards and I just couldn't get a shot. There was one limb in the way. Well, if you'd have trimmed that one limb, you'd be having your hero photos right now, So just those tiny details I think are so important.
It goes back to the Michigan mentality. I mean, I hate to keep interjecting, but one of the things about all this is you do all of these things, and Mark, you're probably the same way, and the deer aren't there. And it's like, it's almost just you're trained to pay attention to every detail, improve every spot. Like I think about the new 80 you had this year. You didn't know what bucks were there.
Right.
There was no care in the world if you were going to hunt something, but you prepped and visualized as if the buck of a lifetime was going to be there. Growing up in Iowa, if there was a big deer in the area, now all of a sudden we paid attention. Now all of a sudden we cared. You know what I mean? And so that I think is the approach where it's like, it doesn't matter what's residing on the piece of property. You're a steward of the land.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
maybe the beginning of this conversation, it's like, what is the benefit of that Michigan struggle? I mean, that seems to be the connection for me, watching, big picture.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I set up all the stuff like you're hunting the buck of a lifetime because you never know when you might be,
Mhm.
And so we do it all the same on each one of them because eventually you're probably going to be hunting a buck there that you're really happy to be hunting. So it's
Yeah.
just the way we go about it.
Scrape trees, rubbing posts. I've seen you install those in some of your locations. What's the fine tune process there? I've seen you've got some specific types of limbs you prefer. I see you've got a very specific post style you're using a lot of the time. How do you do that in the best possible way, and why?
Yeah, and that's all been trial and error. I may have been one of the first guys to ever start using the rubbing post. This goes back to the early 2000s, just after I got here. And it was just, well, if he likes to scrape on this edge, what if he likes to scrape right here by my tree stand, And so it was just a trial thing. I've got some old pictures going way back. And, what worked was just trying different limbs. And I try hickory limb, I try an oak limb, cedar, all this different stuff just to see what if they preferred anything more than another. So that's just more so trial and error and working on all that. Probably the best thing would be in this area is a cedar post. If you had pine like you do in Michigan, you got quite a bit of pine. If you trim down a pine post or a cedar post and then planted that, would probably be better than these store bought and things. But just for ease of going and getting as many as you want, it's easier to go to the lumber yard and just get a bunch of these posts and then drill your hole. But I've got just one cedar post that we trimmed out and planted because I wanted to try it like everything else. Just so I would say that's probably all of that has just been trial and error and what's worked and what hasn't.
For somebody who hasn't seen you do it on video, what is your process? Because you mentioned the limb, but walk somebody through that.
Yeah. And so when I have a good spot, and a lot of times these are beyond food sources or openings, I'll put this rubbing post, 20 yards from my tree. I want it to be a good shot. Obviously, you're not going to put it out 30 or 40 yards and give yourself a tougher shot than you need to. So 20 yards, you don't want him right under your tree, but a good shot that's a makeable shot for you. And then I'm going to point the limb toward my tree because you want him either if he comes from the side or even quartered away, you want him to present that angle. If you put it on the opposite side of your rubbing post or tree or whatever, then possibly that's in the way. So all those little details, and then I'll drill a hole in that rubbing post, and then usually an oak limb is what I'll use, a red oak, because they're pretty good limb. They don't break easily like a white oak or some of the others. And I've got a height I really like, 5.5 feet, 5.5 to 6 feet. I like to have them up there, and just seems to be the ticket. And of course, it's great for inventory. I know I talk about that a lot. There's no other way I'd rather get inventory. I don't know if there's a better way, really.
Do you see that limb staying effective throughout the entire season, or do you ever replace it at some point in the year so you have fresh leaves and it's not all worn down yet?
I usually leave it for the entire season, but that's just because of the size of the scale I'm doing this on now. I mean, it's like 2 days of work to go around to every one of these and replace the limb, And so if you had one, I've had to replace them several times because one had got broken. So if you have that scenario, I'll go replace it right away. But most of the time throughout the season, I'll just leave it as long as that limb's still up.
Okay. What about mock scrapes in general? So not creating a new tree on the middle of a field, but do you ever create mock scrapes under existing trees elsewhere to either enhance the stand site, or some people go really wild with mock scrapes and like to make tons of them all over the place to try to like keep deer on their property. I've seen other people remove licking branches so that deer won't scrape anywhere except for right next to their tree stand where they have one scrape. Do you do anything else like that?
Yeah, both of those. I mean, I'll do that, especially around your stand location. Obviously, if it's a tree that's right there where you want him, I'll do that very thing. A lot of times I'll just add a limb. I'll cut an oak limb. If you've got whatever limb overhanging that's not the right height, I'll just zip tie that limb on so it hangs straight down, and they really seem to like that. And like you said too, if you've got limbs on the other side of the opening, let's say that they really like to hit, you can go cut those down and make this the best scrape right there. So yeah, I do that all the time.
Okay. What about with the stand itself or the blind itself? Is there any fine tuning that you do to either make them more quiet or to better set them up for good shots? What are those final things? Like you pick the tree, you put the stand up, and now you're sitting there just before you leave, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, what are the last couple things I need to do to make sure this is bulletproof or to make sure this is as good as possible? Does anything else stand out that you sometimes do?
I mean, just looking at the tree from a deer's perspective is one thing I like to do, and seeing if you look skylined up there, if you need more cover. I mean, can you get your stand where there's a big limb breaking up your outline? I really like that. If you can get in a tree that's got big limbs coming off or multiple trunks that kind of breaks you up, you don't always have that, but it's one of the things I look at. And then my stand angle I really like too is trying to set that stand to where you can shoot off your left shoulder. For me being right-handed, you don't have to turn completely around on your stand to shoot. I mean, if you get surprised, you're ready to go. So
Yeah.
just those little things.
Okay. So your property's prepped. You know the deer. When was it that you got the confirmed first picture of him that he was alive this year?
Man,
You saw him first.
yeah. Actually, I saw him early in the spring. I saw a buck, and I remember telling Josh this that I thought was Loch Ness at the time, but it was so early in the year I couldn't be certain. I was like, man, I might have been him. So all of a sudden, I'm like, hey, maybe he is alive. And then it was later on, I think it was in July, maybe late July, I had jumped a buck out of the CRP, and I said, it can't be any other buck. It's huge, super wide, kicker stickers, little drop, and huge mass. And I'm like, he's got to be alive. So then it's like just start dumping cameras in these areas, trying to relocate him, see if it is indeed him. So it was maybe middle of August, I think, by the time I checked those cameras and confirmed that he was alive.
Okay. So leading into opening day, you've got sightings from previous years. You have photos from that year and previous years. And then the history of how the property operates, right? How other deer have used it. What were the most important pieces of information in your mind that you had kind of figured out about this deer leading into that first day? Whether it be like personality traits or how he used the landscape or anything else. What were those most important couple things that you had learned up to that point that you thought were going to be critical to your success?
Man, I really don't know. I think just having that area narrowed down to where he liked to live and seeing how he shifted once he shed his velvet, I think was probably the most critical, because if you're hunting 200 yards away from where he's at, obviously you're in a disadvantage. So just knowing where he wanted to be was super critical.
So you knew basically where he wanted to bed. Did you have like a pattern as far as like, man, he usually will come out and feed in this area early, or was there any kind of like annual pattern you were starting to see, or window where you thought my best chance is going to be this window, or anything like that?
I really didn't from years past. That's why I was so surprised to have him on a daylight pattern in that green plot where I ended up getting him, because I didn't have that years past. He was pretty nocturnal. You didn't see much of him. So it was a little surprising to have that this year.
That's kind of what you talked about, Mark, of you've noticed people make that trend of 4 or 5, and then all of a sudden it's 6. I remember you find those sheds. I'm like, so you think you got a good chance if he's alive? You're like, no, not at all. And that's like, I mean, seriously, you talk about personality types of bucks. I know it sounds crazy to some people, like you maybe like humanized this deer, but it's a thing. Like some of the bucks on this wall, they were all around daylight. Loch Ness and the approach you made for him and all the plans, when you found those sheds, really had nothing to do with how you killed him.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
Maybe that'd be something like 4 and 5. What kind of buck was he?
Yeah.
And
yeah, I totally agree with that. He was super nocturnal. I mean, I guess a little bit at 5. I had him at one place we called the Big Oak. I did have him daylight there several times. No real pattern to it, but he would daylight there. That's why I thought I might get my shot right there. So I guess, going back to your point, that there was some historical data right there, but as it turned out, he did start to daylight in that green plot, which was surprising to me. So obviously having that information was critical.
So I heard that you decided not to use cell cameras this year. You went back to standard trail cameras. Can you explain that decision a little bit, especially when you've got your chance at a buck of a lifetime?
Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking there, but when I used to check cameras, like we all did, before cell and all that. I just loved doing that. It was something I really enjoyed. So I would be out there most of the day, and I'm getting my exercise besides. Plus, I'm on the farm that I love. I'm just, so that was the allure to it. I want to get back to that because it's something I just love to do. And then the other thing in regards to the Loch Ness buck is I just wanted that shock value. When he stepped out, I didn't really know he was there, and all of a sudden you're like, well, there he is. And the older guys, we never had that kind of information growing up, and so all of them were like that. You're like, oh my gosh, here he comes, and so I wanted that again with this Loch Ness buck. But then, as we started into the season, I didn't know where he was. I know, Josh, you've talked about it a little bit. It was driving me crazy. I'd be texting Josh, I have no idea where he's at. He left the state. And, in hindsight, he was living in such a small area that's why I wasn't getting him anywhere else, because he just wasn't moving. It was just bed to food, food to bed.
So what was the camera strategy then, as far as since you did not have cell cameras, you were going back to the camera strategy that we were all using, 5-10 years ago, where you had to actually go in there, pull the cards yourself. So did you have more conservative camera placement because of that? Or did you stick them where you always would and just had a certain way you could access them so that it was low impact? How often were you checking them? I'm curious about all that.
Yeah, I put them in the traditional spots where they're easy to check. I'm usually on the fringes or on these paths, like a mowed path, where it's easy to get in and out, scent free, that kind of thing, or by a tree stand. If you go in to hunt it, you can pull the card then. But, as we started getting into the season, I started checking them a little more and a little more, because I'm like, what's going on? Of course, I would only check them with the correct wind for where I thought he was bedding. I'll tell you something that might be a little bit surprising. On that green source, I had 6 cameras on one green source, and it would blow your mind that I would only get him on one camera there, but consistent. And, so finally you started to piece it together, actually, where he's walking out of the timber, how you get him on one camera, not on any of the others. So that's very surprising that he would stay to the middle of that plot most of the time, where he would walk out. And so I knew all that, and you might have seen in the main show, we put a tree stand up just trying to catch that movement.
Yeah.
Of course, it didn't work out that way. We didn't get the wind for it, but it was interesting. We had a good plan because he spent a lot of time in front of that tree stand, as you'll see in the 2 encounters. He was in front of that stand on both.
How big is this green food plot that he was checking out?
It's about 2 acres, maybe just a hair under 2 acres.
Okay, so you've got 6 cameras on 1 2-acre food plot. That's interesting. That's very interesting. I think I understand the why now, because you just described, right? Like, and this is something I've seen too. Like, one camera does not capture nearly a full picture of what's going on in an area like that. How do you decide where those 6 cameras go? And is that something you do on every food source? Do you fully cover food sources in that kind of way, or was that unique just because like you thought Loch Ness was here, and so you're going to cover all major entries or exits?
That's right. Yeah, it was because I thought that deer was living there in that area, and so I was trying to pin down to what he might be doing, because he is such a different deer. He did everything. He wasn't a very social buck. He didn't seem to hang around many deer at all, and so I wanted to really pin down what he was doing specifically, not really caring what any other deer were doing, and so that was unique to that. Usually I've got 1 camera on a food source, maybe 2 sometimes. And usually I'll put them on scrapes this time of year, because you got a real good chance of catching whatever buck that is,
How many did you start with? Because that's one thing. You didn't put 6 there day one.
Right.
I think you had the 1 on the scrape?
Just the one, it was just on the corner of that plot, so you could kind of catch him coming and going.
Mm-hmm. So it was like once you knew he was there.
Yes.
Then it was put them all in.
Yep, on all the scrapes. Now I'm trying to figure out a line of movement is what I was trying to do. I want to see him coming from one way, going to another. And that's also going to help me figure out where he's bedding, But again, you're checking SD cards, so it's not like you're there every day. But I figured it was a long season, Hopefully I was going to have time on my side.
Yeah. What is your process? This doesn't have to be just Loch Ness. This could be larger, all the other bucks, but you're running cameras, you have all these photos. When you're trying to use those photos to inform your hunts, what level of detail do you drill down with those? Are you looking at a specific buck and what he did last year and what he did the year before and the year before, and then trying to find that specific annual pattern and window? Or are you looking and taking a look at, okay, these are the days he daylighted, What was the wind? What was the temperature? What was the barometric pressure? What was the moon? Do you get that nitty gritty into it? Or is it more just for recent, hey, he's moving yesterday or he's moving last week, I should hunt now?
The prior year's data, I think, is very useful. What they did the year before or the year before that, especially as they get older, as you know, we talked about before you started recording, you know, as these deer get older, they keep shrinking these cores down. And so, you know, once they get to 4 and 5 and they're really showing you where they like to be, I think that's critical information. But, you know, the real specific stuff of the wind direction and that, I didn't pay really a lot of attention to it, which I know a lot of guys do. But, you know, I'm going to be out there either way. So I don't, you know, if he walked it on a south wind, it's nice information to know, but he might walk it on a north wind too. So
One thing I hear you talk about a lot is keeping the food the same.
yeah,
That, you know, I think that would be what he puts the most stake in.
that's
I mean,
right.
again, going back to finding those sheds, I'm like, what's the plan? You're like, this is the plan. I don't want to change anything. A lot of people I've been around is like, well, how do I make this better? Or what, you know, it's like, if he's here, don't touch it. But obviously you changed a little bit with that mix. I mean, that might be
Right.
something too. Like, why do you think he was there? Yes, the bedroom, but you gave him a smorgasbord of like, no matter what palatability, that mix had it early season.
Exactly right. I wanted there to be something there that he really liked. And so it had everything in it. And I've done that several times. I think that was why that's what I wanted to do because I'd done it several times before and it always worked out, you know, picket fence and wide nine and crabs buck. And so there was a lot of them that I'd hunted that way and kept it the same and it worked. They did the same thing from year to year. If you don't have another dominant buck that's moving them out of that area, I don't think they're going to go anywhere if you give them everything they need, you know.
Yeah. So I get the idea of wanting to keep the bedroom and the food basically the same so they stick to that usual pattern they've been on. But what about a situation where you don't have that control? So something like what I'm dealing with and all the places I hunt, I guess, is there's corn and bean rotations, right? Every other year the farmers change in what's planted. And so one of the things that I frequently find myself debating is I'm trying to understand these annual patterns that a buck has. And I'm thinking, okay, this is what he did as a 3-year-old. This is what he did as a 4-year-old. And now he's a 5-year-old. I'm trying to hunt him. And I can look at, well, I'll give you my exact scenario this year. I'm after a buck. He's 5. There's corn this year in the area. Now, I've got a whole lot of history and photos of him last year as a 4-year-old. And you would think that would be the most useful because he was more mature, closer to what he is now. But the farm's different because last year the farm had soybeans all over it and it was wide open. This year has corn and there's all sorts of cover. So I'm thinking to myself, well, does his behavior last year, is that the most helpful because he was 4? Or should I actually be looking at him when he was 3? Because that was the time he had the same habitat. There was corn. And so I'm trying to think like maybe I should be paying attention to what he did when it was last corn. What are your thoughts on that and the impact of that crop rotation and how that may or may not impact, you know, an annual pattern of some type?
Yeah, I would say you look at both of those. You kind of weigh all that out together and see if there's anything that you see he did on both years. You know, maybe that's what you look at. But on years that are corn, you're always going to have more deer in there. I shouldn't say always, but most of the time when you get to that cold weather, they gravitate toward corn. I used to tell my neighbors, you know, my friends and stuff that they would have these great food plots and all these beans and stuff, and their neighbor had all this corn. I'd be like, dude, you got to have corn. I'm telling you, if you don't have corn on your farm, you're at a disadvantage because they will. There's a time of year they will gravitate to corn, and that's where they'll be. So I like your odds this year with corn on that farm.
Yeah. When you've got corn that you can control, which I'm thinking you do have, I guess, do you have plots that you planted in corn or own that you can mow or manipulate in some kind of way? And if so, is there anything you do to take advantage of that? Because I know a lot of folks will cut down corn in front of their blind at a certain time of year, or they will have a, you know, access routes or hub of a wheel type design and using standing corn in a strategic way. Have you ever done that?
Yeah, quite a bit actually. The hub of the wheel thing is one that's pretty killer. You have all these paths coming into your blind setup or your tree stand. That's a lot of fun because they will actually use those. You know, they're not going to fight the corn, especially a buck like Loch Ness. It's that wide. He can't even go down the rows, you know, corn rows. And so these paths like that. I mean, I didn't have any set up for him, but I've done that in the past and it works very good. You can even do that in soybeans, even though they can walk right through them. They just like walking down a wide open path. It just seems easiest for them, path of least resistance. That's one of those terms that, we've been using for, I don't know, 25, 30 years. When you read articles and all that, they take the path of least resistance. Just like when you're walking through the timber and you circle up around the head of a ditch, path of least resistance, that's the same thing they're going to do 9 out of 10 times.
Are there any other examples of you making paths of least resistance where you want them?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Crossings, ditch crossings would be a big one where, maybe you've got a food plot in a ditch, an erosion ditch, and you need access to it, farm access. Well, I'm going to manipulate where I put that farm crossing, just so happens to be by a really good tree, So
Yeah.
that's something you can do.
Yeah.
Driving through your green plot.
Yeah, drove through the green plot to make tracks, so hopefully they'll walk down those, again, path of least resistance. Yeah, good point.
Yeah. And they'll take that little tire track just a little bit easier, huh?
Yeah, it's surprising the things that they'll do that you would think, well, they can walk across the green just as easy, but they're just, by nature, they're just lazy or conservative. I'd say that. They're just smart. They conserve energy,
Mm-hmm. All right. So the next thing I'm curious about, I'm going to keep on taking you down the path of my hunt and using your hunt to help my hunt. I'm hunting a specific buck. Like I mentioned, I just told you one of the things I'm thinking about. And one of the constant struggles it's a fun struggle, but it's one of the things that I stay up late thinking about is trying to make the decision of where to hunt this deer, right? And so kind of similar to your hunt with Loch Ness, I have a pretty strong idea of, where I think he's bedded a lot of the time. He's got his pocket that he owns now, it seems like. But then it's on any given day, where do I hunt around that pocket, right? You look at wind and you say, okay, these are the places I could safely hunt with the wind. But then you're trying to make the determination, well, is he going to go east on this day or west this day? Or is he going south this day? I'm curious, when you were thinking about Loch Ness or some of your other deer, if there's a better example, what does your decision-making process look like when trying to make that call? Where do I hunt on this given day? I know his core, but now I'm trying to pick, the spot within that zone. Can you walk me through the criteria you're looking at and how you specifically zone in on the perfect place for today?
As you alluded to, the wind direction and all that stuff's pretty standard. I've got to hunt this on this wind direction. I think if you can pin down where he's likely to be feeding, or if you're getting pictures of him feeding there, that sure helps an awful lot, because now you can kind of put a line of travel together. Even though maybe you don't know exactly where he's bedding, maybe you know the hub or the general woodlot where he's bedding. So now you can start to pick, okay, maybe he's using this path or this way to get to that food. And a lot of times, if you can get closer to the bedding area, all the better. I've seen some really big mature bucks that won't feed out into like an ag field with the rest of the deer. I'll see does come through and maybe smaller bucks and stuff, and they'll feed out up into a field, ag field, and they're all up there. And the big mature buck is just standing down there wasting time, making scrapes, rubbing. He's just on the edge of the bedding, and he's waiting for dark, and then he's going to walk out. Of course, that all changes during the rut. I mean, that's why so many big deer get killed. But the closer you can be to that bedding area with that scenario, I think the better off you are.
What about this? What about a situation where there's not just that one food source that he's hitting, where it's not just a line of from A to B? What if it's like there's a B and a C and a D and an E, and he's got like 3 or 4 different options? How do you try to approach a hunt like that? Because I've sometimes found myself in a situation like that where I'll be like, okay, well, today I'll hunt B, and then tomorrow I'll hunt C, and the next day I'll hunt D, or I'll chase a picture or something. I'll see, I had a daylight picture from 2 days ago at A, so I go to A, and then he's at C, and then I will go and hunt him at C, and then he's at D. Do you bounce around like that too? If a buck has multiple lines he might be taking, like I kind of have a lot of spots where it's like a hub of a wheel situation where the buck's bedroom is at that hub, but then on any given day, he's got an option to go north or south or east or west. Do you chase him around, or are you the type that likes to pick one spot and give it 3 days in a row because eventually he'll cycle through.
Yeah, I don't hunt 3 days in a row in a given spot very often. I mean, I think you can look at that historical data and see if you can find anything. Okay, he was here on this day, and sometimes you can put stake in that. That's a good, good way to go about it. But I think more than anything in that scenario is you just got to put your time in. I really think there's no magic secret sauce to it. You just got to be there. I mean, there's so much of it, goes about, you can talk about, what a great hunter you are and all this, but so much of it goes back to just that grit and determination of just being there when the opportunity presented itself.
For me, going back to, again, the beginning of this conversation, for you, you can put that time in, though, that maybe other guys aren't going to see the same results because you paid attention to your entrance, to your exit. I think that's why you're able to hunt so many different spots. Whereas, like,
Right.
a guy like me, it's like, well, if I go in there, man, I'm worried about bumping them out. You bounce around so much and have so much success, though, because you're, like we talked about, the deer don't know you're there.
Right. It's like you're never there. Hey, yeah, I agree with that. Yep.
How many hunts did it take this season before you killed Loch Ness? Was it 3?
I want to say it was
4.
5 hunts, maybe 4 days and 5 hunts. We hunted one morning for him.
Okay. Could you walk me through each of those 5 hunts and just tell me why you hunted each specific spot, like what your thought process was, why you thought that would be a place to kill, and how you were able to get in and out and pull off each of those hunts? I think that might be a useful example.
Yeah, I mean, so I think I've got a daylight pattern on him on that green source. If you look back to a couple weeks prior, I had a bunch of pictures of him in daylight on that green source. So, of course, I'm thinking if he keeps doing that, I've got a really good shot to see him, get a crack at him. And so the first time I hunted, I think was the 3rd, October 3rd. And we had that real warm weather. It was high 80s. I didn't hunt the first 2 days. I don't want to do more harm than good. And it finally cooled down about 10 degrees. So we went into that green source on a south wind and hunted the tree stand that we set up on the main show, when Josh was with me. And I thought that was the right spot to catch him where he'd been coming out, which he came out both times we've seen him. He came out of that side. And he never did show up that day. So he was in there later after dark, and maybe that just goes back to the temperature. He was just moving nocturnal. So that was day 1. Day 2, I believe we went and hunted. I actually set a different spot because I thought I knew where he was bedding. So I went and hunted a spot where I could watch a big field. If he wasn't, I'm thinking, okay, he's not moving through this green source in daylight right now. Maybe he just shed his velvet, went nocturnal. I want to be able to watch an area where I think is close to where he's bedding and see if he's coming out a different direction, maybe. Generally they're moving some during daylight, even during this time of year. It's just not far. And so I set a spot where I could just watch quite a bit of area. It's just open with a lot of honey locust and brush and stuff. And we sat there and had a real slow hunt. And I remember saying, when you're hunting a deer like this, that's just not social, he's not around a lot of other deer. It doesn't really bother me to get skunked even. We've seen a couple deer, but, to see that one deer is all you're after. And so that's why I set that, and it didn't work out. But I thought maybe we'd gain some valuable information, Day 3, we went into his bedroom where I thought he was bedding. We're going to be on the downwind edge of it. Got in there nice and early. And the weather just didn't turn out that day. It started picking up crazy wind. Thunderstorm came in. Is what happened. Thunder started booming. I said, we're out of here. I'm not sitting in the tree in this gust and wind, So we just got down and left that morning. And of course, you worry, did you do any harm that day? Anytime you're going in the dark, you don't want to bump into him. And so, that was the concern for sure.
Yes. So before you go any further, Owen, can you tell me why you were willing to swing? That seems like a pretty big swing. You went in on a morning hunt in early October into his bedroom. Why were you what made you want to take that aggressive of a move at that point in the season with those conditions?
I just felt like if he's living in that small of an area, I think you just have a chance to kill him. If you're going to go in right where he's moving, he's going to move some in daylight. Once he gets into that cover, I think you have a very good chance of seeing him. And, I'm just willing to take that risk. I've got, high confidence that if we see him, we're going to get a crack at him in this small of an area.
And that was the front end of that weather change, too.
That was, yeah. Yeah, the weather patterns, thought maybe it'd have him up on his feet a little more.
what was your access and exit to get into there before he did, hopefully? And then how'd you get out of there without possibly spooking him?
Well, it's the same as most. It's just an erosion ditch. Just dropped in an erosion ditch, walked it up, and there again, the tree stand, like I talked about before, there a lot of times are right on the edge of these ditches or creeks. So when you get down out of the tree, you just drop into this creek, walk the drainage all the way out.
Yeah.
And so that's what we did. That matter of fact, we got down. There was a little fork horn or something's bedded right by the tree, and we got down and walked out and never even bumped him.
Yeah, it's nice to have those dishes. I wish we had more of those by me.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was day 3 or hunt 3. What was next?
So then we went back to the green source. I still didn't know where he was at this point. I remember this is when I was, texting Josh, kind of freaking out. Where'd he go? He disappeared. Can I turn my cell cams back on? No, I didn't say that, but you're kind of second guess your decision at that point. You're like, man, did I mess up? Because it's a deer of a lifetime, and obviously you don't want anything bad to happen. Anything could happen. EHD gets caught in a fence or whatever. So we go back to the green source, but now we have, instead of the southern winds we had, now it's out of the west-northwest. So we've got to switch where we can set. We can't hunt the tree stand anymore because it cuts right across the green source. And so we go down and hunt the blind I ended up getting him out of. That we had an encounter, that night. We ended up seeing him. I didn't think he was going to show. I closed out the segment, my blog. So, he's a no-show today, and there's 10 minutes left probably, and out he pops.
And so how was that blind positioned in relation to, where he thought he was bedded? Like, why was that blind where it was?
And that was there historically. I mean, the reason it was where it was is because it's close to the creek. It sets you up kind of in the middle of that plot so you can get movement coming from either direction. It's kind of an L-shaped or boomerang. And so it's in that little hub in the middle, and then it's backed up to a creek. And so that had been there for several years. We didn't just set that up for him, all of a sudden.
Okay. So you see the buck. He's out there after dark. I saw the video where you waited a long time to make sure he was gone, and then you had a great exit route out of there. And I understand you have prepared a second vehicle to ensure you could get out of there smart. Can you talk about your 2-vehicle exit strategy?
Yeah, I just thought about it, in advance. I said, and what if we get pinned down in that blind? We've got to have another place we can get out and walk this creek, which is why the blind is there to start with, is so you can exit on that creek. So I just, did that in advance. I said, let's just play it smart, go park this other vehicle there. If we have to walk out that way, it's there, and then we'll just drive back to the main vehicle we used to get in. And so
what struck me when we talked about that was your entrance was right across the plot. Mm-hmm. Which some people might be like, you're walking across the area that these deer are going to go feed. You talk about leaving scent trails and disturbing where your deer are going to be. Talk about that where the entrance is, because I think the geographic features influence that. You walk in on the mode or just the driven path,
right? Paying
attention to scent. I mean, again, these are along those lines of like, I feel like you're just like, that's what I do.
It is, yeah.
Me as a hunter, I'm like, why would you walk across the food plot? How'd you get away with that? Why they just walk right where you did? And why'd you leave? Because the way you exited was completely different.
Right.
And talk about that too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it just, like you said, this is what we do all the time is these paths, whether it's a path you just drive in on, so you have, no vegetation or very little. And then just being meticulous about your scent control, I think, is a big deal. I started when I got out here. I wasn't meticulous. Sprays were just starting to come out, and I would have deer track me to my tree stand all the time. They cut your trail, and then you have to start figuring out ways to get in where they're not going to cut your trail. That was your entry route then, is to go around where they're not going to come across your trail. And so once we started being meticulous about the boots and the pant legs and all that and keeping the vegetation low, I found that we can get away with just cutting right across the plot if you do that, and I watch him cut my trail all the time. And of course, poor Devin, a lot of times I'm like, dude, when I walk across this, you got to be in the same path as me because I want one scent trail.
Yeah.
If you walk over here 5 feet from me, I'm going to be like, dude, what are you doing? That's just how ridiculous in attention to detail we are. And so it works though. That's the thing. We see it over and over. They just don't cut that. And then, getting in, like Josh alluded to, there's just topography there. They can't see you. And then when you get farther down the hill, there's cedars in there. They really can't see you. And on a west or northwest wind, you got a good wind for it too. Even though it's at your back, it's still blowing into an area that there shouldn't be any deer bedded. And so,
Okay.
Like that
So
again. Yeah, I hear that. I'm like, you walked in with the wind at your back. You never hear that.
right.
And you went that way just because you knew that was the only way to get in there without having to walk through the bedding, but also not have him wind you.
Correct. Yeah. Now, the way we exit through the creek, you do have to go through bedding. Like you said, if you walk in that way, you probably bump deer. And so, but when you walk out that way, the deer are gone by then. And so it's a great, great way to get out of there.
So you see him, it's after dark, you slip out down through the creek. Did you feel really confident you got out of there without him spooking? Or were you kind of like, well, I sure hope he didn't see us climb out of the tree? How confident were you with your exit?
I felt great about it. We got out and climbed out. We didn't hear a peep. And we knew he was still in the field just up the hill farther, because I was putting binos on him. And we never heard anything when we got out of there. And of course, when I seen that and I felt we got out clean, I felt really good already about the next day's hunt. You'll probably see that in the interview. I'm like, tomorrow sets up really good. It's still cool. He didn't know we were there. I think we got a real good shot at him.
So here's the biggest question of the whole podcast. How do you get your cameramen not to take 45 minutes to get out of the tree and make tons of noise while they're trying to do it?
Well, yeah, you just got to be patient. I mean, you're going to make noise sometimes, and it's just the way it goes.
All that camera gear.
I'm probably all the time needling him, like, yeah, could you make some more noise, please?
Yeah, not easy to have two people up there and all that gear and all that extra time, and it's constantly giving me a heart attack worrying about that. But okay, so did you have like zero questions, like we're coming back to the same place tomorrow, or was there any part of you that thought like, well, he doesn't usually do two things or he doesn't do the same thing day after day, right? You hadn't been seeing anything that consistent from the past. So did any part of you think like I should try to go somewhere else because he will do something different? Or were you very confident he'll do the same thing tomorrow?
I was pretty confident, or at least I thought we had a good shot that he'd do the same thing. After we saw him and we had the same conditions the next day, I felt good about him doing the same thing.
Okay.
It doesn't always work out that way, as you know, but
yeah,
sometimes it does.
Now I want before we talk about the good news, I want to imagine a bad news scenario. So imagine you went back in the next day, you hunted that spot, and you did not see him. What would your strategy have looked like over the next couple weeks if you had not killed Loch Ness? What were you thinking? Like, I'm guessing you're like me in that during the hunt, I'm already planning, well, what do I have to do tomorrow or next week or the next time I can hunt if this doesn't work out? What was your game plan going to be moving forward if you didn't get him killed on that day?
Well, if you go back to the day before where I didn't even know if he still existed, my game plan was to go check some cameras right there on that plot and see if he had been on that scrape again where he was consistent. I just wanted to know he was alive and in the area. And then, that particular day, if he doesn't show up, I think I just keep hunting him the same way. I think I know where he's bedding, so you just keep hunting the fringes of that, taking your shots at him. I mean, nothing's ever 100%, so you just keep taking your highest odds. That's always what I talk about, is picking the spot where you have the highest odds. And, that's what I would have done.
And how do you balance, and we've talked about this, I guess, but how aggressive would you continue to be through October? Would you literally hunt every night or every day throughout October because your access and exit is so good? Or at any point do you back off for a while and wait for something better? A lot of people will only take their shots when they've got like this perfect weather condition or something. So they'll take a handful, couple few shots throughout the month or something. Are you literally day after day after day?
Not if it's terrible weather in my mind, like the first couple of days where it's 90 degrees. I mean, I feel like there's low chance that he's going to move in daylight, which, you never know. You could still kill him if you're out there, but at some point, there's just too much risk and not enough reward. And that, so I've got to have at least good weather conditions to go after him. And so that's usually what I go with. If I feel like I have a good day where he would move, I'm going to hunt somewhere.
What's good enough? Like what's that threshold where it's huntable?
I think for this time of year, if you've got stuff in the 60s, especially high pressure, a switch in wind direction, all the things we talk about, some of the triggers, anything like that, I think is good enough to give it a shot.
Speaking of triggers, what are the most important things in your mind when it comes to that trigger that you think will really send them over the edge and maybe make you be more aggressive than usual? You mentioned change in wind direction. Do you give much credit to pressure or cold fronts or any kind of moon thing or anything else?
Yeah, I think number one for me is that cold front, that temperature differential, and you go from 90 down to 50 or, anything like that. I think that is a trigger that gets almost all of them up on their feet. Even the most nocturnal bucks will usually be up and moving on those cold fronts. I've killed several of them on cold front like that, so I'm a big believer in them. And then I do love the high pressure as well. When you start getting multiple things together, I think it just gets stronger and stronger. I like a rising moon in the evening. If you've got that too, then you just have to be out there at that point.
Okay. So you're going to keep hunting based on wind direction and based on, making sure you've got huntable conditions. What do those stand sites look like as the month progresses? Is there just a circle or a semicircle around his bed that you're just kind of cycling through based on things? Or are you going to get to a point in late October or November where it dramatically changes in some kind of way because we're shifting from a, October bed to feed pattern to a rut type pattern?
I think in this particular case, it would probably look the same because there's a lot of does there. And so there's no reason for him to leave in this case. But, to your point, there are cases where, yeah, you're hunting him where he's at, but he's not around a lot of does. So he's going to be somewhere where you want to start hunting the does. And that's always my strategy as we get toward late October is I want to be hunting somewhere where we're going to see does and somewhere where there's a little pinch, whether it be a farm access road, some kind of crossing. I like to couple those two things together, so if they're just out cruising and there are no does, you still got a chance to catch him. Or if there's does out there and he comes out and bumps them around, you got a chance to catch him. So it's just about upping your odds, I think is the way I look at it. What can you do or where can you hunt that just ups your odds that much more?
Can you describe for me an example of you gave me a loose example there, but could you discuss a specific stand site for that time of year that has that kind of like multiple stacked features? That'd be a great one of your like actual great spots for that rut time period. Let's say like for Loch Ness, what would be your best spot to kill Loch Ness in November if you had still had to hunt him at that point? Could you describe what that might look like?
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a great spot for Loch Ness off the top of my head, but if you go back to like where I killed the wide nine's a perfect example of where I would hunt for that time of year. We've got these access roads that cut through between field to field, and so they follow those. You're on the edge of the creek, so you've got the access, and you're on food sources, so you've got the does. So that's a perfect example, and I have that on either end of that field is the same kind of setup, which those are my favorites of that time of year. You get into the rut or late October. Love those.
Okay. And all of those crossings are in bow range.
Yeah. Yep, exactly right.
Yeah, that's pretty dynamite. Now, what about if we were to take that same question, but I asked you, where that would be, where like a ideal spot to kill him would be? Let me look here at the calendar. So if this podcast is going to come out October 19th. So this podcast will come out October 19th, 2023. If someone's listening to this the day it comes out and they're going to hunt this coming weekend, which would be Friday the 20th or Saturday the 21st or Sunday the 22nd. So they're listening to this before they're heading out for their weekend hunt. Describe to me the ideal setup you would have tried for that date range. And if there's a stand site you can think of that you could describe in detail that would be perfect for those dates.
Yeah, I think, where I ended up killing him from just south of that, or north of that actually, is a south wind setup that's right there, kind of like what we talked about. It's a go-between. It's on a food source, but there's a nice trail that goes into some bedding, good entry and exit again. I mean, I'm still going to be hunting around food that time of year. It's not, November 7th where I want the best funnel there is on the farm. I still want to be around a food source because, again, I just want to up my odds. So if he comes out to feed and he's not fired up on, because a lot of times a 6-year-old buck, he knows when the time's right as far as the does are concerned, where the 2 and the 3-year-olds are going berserk, So he might just come out and feed and doesn't care about the does yet. So I want to be on that food source so you can catch that. But I also want the does around. So if that particular food source, maybe you're hunting an oak flat or something and there's no does in there, I don't like that scenario either because you can't cash in on the doe scenario. So I want both of those.
Yeah. I'm stuck on something you mentioned a little while ago, which was that you wouldn't hunt a spot 3 times in a row. But you did have an example where you would sit a spot 2 days in a row. And you also have talked about how you've got this great access and exit routes where you can hunt generally over and over and over again in this area because you've designed it and you've planned it in a good way. So I'm curious to better understand when you will hunt someplace again. Because like imagine I'm out hunting October 21st and I'm hunting a spot like you just described. Let's say I do see some does and I see some young bucks, but I don't see the buck I'm after. And conditions are consistent the next couple days and I can sneak out of there and I feel like I got out. The question is like, okay, do I try somewhere brand new or do I just stick it out here for another day? Because like he didn't come today, but he very well could come tomorrow. Like when do you ever stick it out in a spot for more than that one day? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's there again, you're just weighing your odds. And a lot of times it's dependent on the wind. If the wind stays the same, maybe you're limited to just a couple of options, And so I like to bounce around to keep areas fresh, even though we have the great access and all that. Maybe you could hunt it 5 days in a row without burning it out. But, that's the biggest concern is, maybe you do get does that get downwind of you in a specific spot or whatever, So if you can bounce around and keep them fresh, that's ideal to me. But like in this case, you said, I hunted it 2 days in a row just because I thought the odds were so good that he'd step out again. And so there are times where you're just weighing the odds. That's the best place to be. And so I'm just going to go hunt it again.
Okay.
You never know.
I've heard you say, and I'm going to get the exact wording wrong, so you're going to have to correct me on the exact wording. But you've said something like, well, these old bucks, they put on their pants all the same way, or something like that. Before I say any more, can you tell me the right way? What's the saying exactly?
They put on their fur one leg at a time like all the other 6-year-old bucks.
Okay, there you go. So, why do you say that? Like, what do you mean by that? What's the message like you're trying to remind yourself of when you say that? And then secondly, how did that help you when it came to hunting this Loch Ness buck?
Yeah, I guess what I mean by that is they probably don't behave any different than a different 6-year-old buck. We get so intimidated because a deer has 200-inch or bigger antlers, that we're scared to death to do anything. But another 6.5-year-old buck that's 120 inches might act the same way. We all know, you're not as intimidated and you can kill him. But when it comes to this great big buck, can you kill him, and you feel all the pressure, you're more nervous and rightfully so because it's such a rare thing. But, I think that thinking just lets you know that he's still just a 6-year-old buck. There's nothing special about the way he thinks, even though, a lot of bucks are individuals. They might do things different than others. But as a general, to put them in a general class, they're basically all 6-year-old bucks. And I think that helped just keep me calm in the moment, too. It's like, he's just a normal deer. I can hit him just like I hit wide 9 and all these others.
Yeah. So I understand you do a lot of work to make sure you can handle moments like that. Can you describe some of the things that you did this year or in past years to make sure that your moment of truth ability is as high as possible? Because a lot of people shoot in their backyard a bunch, but is that enough? What else do you do?
Yeah, I don't think it's enough. Of course, you can't overestimate experience. Being there, time and time again obviously helps you a lot. But there's things I think you can do to prepare for that, and it's what I call pressure practice. You try to put yourself under the most pressure you can. Granted, you can't always have a 200-inch deer in front of you, that kind of pressure, but, shooting a lot of 3Ds, I would go to the ASA shoots, and, I love to come in better than I did the previous time, so it's pressure to me because, I want to score the best possible. I'd like to win. I mean, I'm a competitive guy. I played sports and all that, so just the most pressure possible. I remember shooting the course out here and had Devin filming. And I said, Devin, I want you to come up and try to create the most pressure possible. I mean, you get right in my face with the camera. I know everybody's watching me. You can't act like, well, I don't know if this is getting filmed or whatever. You're right in your eyeball. And so, it's just a little bit more pressure. And I think a lot of times that's the difference between freaking out when he comes out and saying, yeah, I've been here 100 times and it's just another shot,
It astounded me with how long the encounter was. Usually you always hear people say it's easier to hold that cool and he pops out, kill him.
Yeah.
So that deer was out in front of you for how long?
It was about half an hour. Yeah.
There's no way I would have been able to keep that.
What was going through your mind during that half hour, Owen?
Oh, I was just excited to be there, really. I mean, like we talked about, it'd been 40 years in the making of just being a diehard, bow hunter, just falling in love with deer hunting and dreaming of this time. And there he stands right in front of me and I'm glassing him and smiling and just happy to be there, It just feels so fortunate really in that moment.
Did at any time you have some self-talk where you had to say, don't screw this up, Owen, or anything like that? Or were you locked in, confident you were in it?
I was super confident, and I know I said on another podcast, I didn't want that to come across arrogant, I'm the best shot in the world, whatever. I don't feel like that, but when you put so much work into it, you have a certain level of confidence, and that's how I felt. I kept thinking, like, if he gives me an opportunity, I don't think he's getting out of here, is how I felt about it, and, so anything can go wrong. So, I mean, you never know, but of course, I think you always have a little bit of doubt creeps in the back of your mind, right? I really hope something doesn't go wrong here. I mean, because anything can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. How many times have you had like the field filling up just perfect and the buck you're after is going to come out and then that coyote comes running out or something, right?
Exactly right. Or that one doe starts acting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that one doe usually. So you got him. You got the buck. I'll save any more details for the episode that I think will be out on YouTube by the time this podcast airs, right, Josh?
Yes, sir. Yeah, it'll be up on Monday.
So if anyone hasn't seen the video yet, you absolutely should go to the Midwest Whitetail YouTube channel and check that out. But tell me this, Owen. You've had a little bit of time now to look back on it and kind of marinate in this whole experience. What's the greatest lesson you learned from this buck and this hunt?
Man, I don't know. I might have to give that some thought, really. I don't know that I have a quick answer for that. I mean, I'd say one that might throw you off a little bit is how much I appreciate people and friends now. So it's a little off topic from the deer, but
Sure.
it's been so awesome having all the people reach out and having the friends with me on the recovery. Losing my parents a couple years back, it changed me in a way that it just made me appreciate people more. And I think that's been the big takeaway of this whole thing for me is just I've appreciated people in the whole thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great reminder and a great reminder to put things in perspective too. Yeah. As much as these big deer get us excited and obsessed, there are bigger things in the world that matter a whole lot, those relationships being right there at the top.
Yeah.
All right. So with that said then, Owen, I want to bring us back to deer though with one last question, which I think will tie a bow on all this really nicely. I think what this conversation has done for me is given me a lot of good ideas to think about when you're chasing that one special deer and how your whole history as a hunter has led you to be in a position where all the work over the decades and all the work over the last 6 years on this property and all the work this year to get prepared for this single deer, it all culminated to this moment. I imagine there's a lot of folks listening who have their own version of that story. The specifics are different, but they've got their own version. They've got their own Loch Ness. My Loch Ness is a 140-inch 10-pointer. Someone else's Loch Ness might be a 170-inch 12-pointer, and there might be someone else listening who their Loch Ness is a 110-inch 3-year-old that'd be their biggest buck ever, and they are so excited to get after that deer. To someone who's after that one special buck for themselves this year, what would be the 3 pieces of advice or the 3 rules you could write down if you guys were sitting at the dinner table together talking to this person and you had a napkin in front of you and you could write 3 things on that napkin and hand it to them and say, hey, just do not forget these 3 things? what would those 3 things be?
Well, I know what one of them would be for sure, and I know Josh and we've talked about this before, but it's definitely attention to detail. If you can be meticulous and pay attention to everything, I think you're way ahead of the game with any buck, really, and it's especially the buck of a lifetime. I think that resonates with me. The other thing, like we just talked about, is he puts on his fur one leg at a time, like every 6-year-old buck. Just you got to think about him like another deer, even though he's your buck of a lifetime, and maybe you'll never top it or whatever. He's still killable like other deer. So I mean, you hunt him like you would another 6-year-old buck. And then the other thing maybe is just the determination and the grit, because I've been in that situation a lot of times before. You're hunting a great big buck and he's not cooperating, and just keep going every day out there. Just keep after him and don't give up on it would be my other words of advice.
Wise words. I am so happy for you, Owen, that this hunt came together for you. And I'm appreciative that you were willing to talk about it here with me and the folks listening, and to kind of humor me with all my crazy questions about it. I've definitely enjoyed it.
Humbled by it, man. I sure appreciate it.
And Josh,
and thank you too, Josh, for being here.
Yeah. And so that's a perfect segue to you, Josh. Can you give folks the rundown of, we already said it once, but where can folks see the film, the video about this hunt, and where are all the many other places and things that folks can be looking for from Midwest Whitetail?
Yeah. Well, this particular episode will come out on Monday. What would that be? For the 16th. That can be found on Midwest Whitetail YouTube channel. That'll also be available on Carbon TV, Waypoint TV. So pretty much all different places you can stream, Realtree 365. But another thing to know would be, Owen's got another tag. And my favorite thing personally to follow along with is his daily blog. You can find that on the Midwest Whitetail Daily channel. That's where you're a little bit more of a goofball. And
oh, yeah.
He's always so serious on camera, and so humble. But man, one thing on the napkin discussion that I think you emulate more than most folks that I've got the chance to work with, you have so much fun doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's very few times that no matter the circumstance, I haven't seen you just intrinsically enjoy doing it, being out there hunting.
Truly love being out there.
Yeah.
There's no way to hide it.
And so I've never seen you let adversity or something going wrong get in the way of that. But that daily channel is a great place to follow along if you want to, number one, see what he's doing every day. But number two, you're pretty engaging with questions there. And I think that that's very, very cool. You take the time to respond to different folks. And obviously the Midwest Whitetail website, and we're trying to do a good job on the social channels, bringing things a little bit more real time or being more accessible. So those would be the spots. I really appreciate you guys letting me be here. I mean, I didn't really bring much to the table. I mean, I just got to sit and listen to two guys that got a lot of respect for. And, it's pretty cool to see two different paths, both coming from Michigan, living the dream you set out to live. I mean, obviously you're a little bit further into the journey, but, this is an inspiring one if somebody wanted to put that scope on, for sure.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Josh. And thank you, Owen. I'm excited to watch the video when it comes out. And I'm sure it's only a matter of time till tag number 2 gets filled, Owen. I would not want to be a deer on any of the farms that you hunt. That's for sure.
Let's hope.
All right, and that's going to do it. Thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope you've been out there enjoying this great, cool weather that at least a lot of us across the country have been having this fall so far. It's looking good heading into the pre-rut here, the end of October. Get out there, hunt hard. The rut is just ahead of us, so get ready for it. That best time of year is almost here. Until then, stay wired to hunt.